She never married, she never wanted wealth. And when someone offered her the entire world, she said one sentence that left him speechless. In the streets of ancient Basra, in a time when scholars debated theology in grand mosques and kings built empires on gold, there lived a woman who owned almost nothing. No house of luxury, no servants, no family name that opened doors. Yet when the greatest scholars of her generation spoke about love for Allah, they quoted her. When the most powerful men proposed marriage to her, she turned them away, not out of arrogance, but because of something burning inside her that none of them could understand. Her name was Rabia al Adawiyya, and her story, the real story, the one that begins in chains and ends in a love so deep it redefined how Muslims understood devotion, starts in a place you would never expect. To understand who Rabia became, you have to understand where she came from, and where she came from was darkness, complete, crushing, unrelenting darkness. She was born in Basra, in modern-day Iraq, around the year 95 AH, roughly 713 or 714 CE by the Gregorian calendar. Basra at that time was one of the most important cities in the Islamic world. It was a center of learning, of trade, of ambition. Scholars gathered there, wealth poured in from every direction, the Umayyad Caliphate was still in power, and the cities of Iraq were growing, expanding, becoming monuments to human achievement. But Rabia was born far from that world of power and prestige. She was born into a family so poor that on the night of her birth, according to early biographical accounts recorded by scholars such as Farid al-Dinatar, in his famous work Tadkirat al-Awliya, her father had nothing. Not a drop of oil to light a lamp, not a scrap of cloth to wrap the newborn child. The house was bare, the night was dark. Her father, it is said, was a man of faith. He loved Allah. He prayed. He tried to provide. But poverty had gripped his household with an iron hand, and there was nothing he could do to shake it off. The birth of a daughter in such conditions, in a society that already looked down upon girls, was not celebrated the way it should have been. And then things got worse. Rabia was the fourth daughter born to her parents. In Arabic, the name Rabia itself comes from the root word meaning fourth. She was named for her place in the order of her siblings. There was no grand ceremony, no feast, no announcement, just a family struggling to survive and another mouth to feed in a home where food was already scarce. What happened next in Rabia's early years is recorded in fragments. The historical sources do not give us a complete picture. They give us flashes, moments. But those moments are enough to understand the magnitude of her transformation. At some point during her childhood, catastrophe struck. Her parents died, the family was scattered, and Rabia, still young, still vulnerable, still a child, was separated from everything she knew. Some sources say a famine swept through Basra. Others say it was a series of events, one tragedy building on another, that dismantled her family piece by piece. Whatever the exact cause, the result was the same. Rabia was alone. A young girl with no parents, no protector, no home, no money, and no way to survive on her own in a city that was unforgiving to those who had nothing. And in that vulnerability, someone took advantage. Rabia was captured, taken, sold into slavery. Think about that for a moment. A free-born Muslim girl, the daughter of a man who prayed and believed and trusted Allah through every hardship. And she was now property. She was sold for a small amount of money. Some narrations say it was just a few dirhams, a human life valued at less than the price of a meal. Her new reality was one of servitude. She was forced to work, she was forced to obey, she was given no freedom, no dignity, no choice in anything. The streets of Basra continued to bustle with scholars and merchants and soldiers, but for Rabia, the world had shrunk to the walls of servitude, to the commands of a master, to days that began before dawn and ended long after sunset. This is the point where most people would break. This is where hope dies for most human beings. When everything has been taken, your family, your freedom, your name, your future, what is left? For Rabia, something was left. Something that her father had planted in her heart before he died. Something that no master could buy, and no chain could reach, and no amount of suffering could extinguish. She had Allah. Even in slavery, Rabia prayed. Not the prayer of someone asking to be rescued, though she may have asked for that too, but the prayer of someone who was speaking to the only one who still saw her, the only one who still knew her, the only one who had not abandoned her. The narrations tell us that she would finish her exhausting work for the day, and then, while the household slept, she would stand in prayer, alone, in the dark, hour after hour. Not because someone told her to, not because anyone was watching, but because, for Rabia, standing before Allah was the only time she felt free. There is something about the night prayer that strips away everything false. In the stillness, there are no titles, no wealth, no social status, no master and slave. There is only the soul and its creator. And in those hours, Rabia found something that would define the rest of her life. She found that the connection to Allah was not a means to an end. It was not a transaction. It was not, I pray and you give me what I want. It was love. Not the love of convenience, not the love that appears when life is easy and disappears when life is hard, but a love that is born in fire, that is forged in suffering, that grows deeper with every wound because there is nowhere else for the heart to turn. This was the foundation being laid in those dark nights of slavery. Rabia was being shaped, not by a teacher in a mosque, not by a book of theology, but by pain, by isolation, by the complete removal of everything this world offers. And in that emptiness, she discovered a fullness that most people never find even in a lifetime of abundance. But Rabia's story was far from over. In fact, the event that would change everything, the moment that would break her chains and set her on a path that scholars would discuss for over 1,000 years, was about to happen. And it began with something her master saw one night that he was never supposed to see. The accounts of what happened that night differ slightly depending on the source, but the core of the story is consistent across the major biographical works. And it is one of those moments that once you hear it, you do not forget. Rabia's master, the man who had purchased her, who saw her as nothing more than labor, as a servant to cook and clean and work, woke up one night. Perhaps it was chance, perhaps he was restless, perhaps something stirred him. Whatever the reason, he rose from his bed and moved through the darkened house. And then he saw her. Rabia was standing in prayer, alone, in the middle of the night. Her body was worn from the labor of the day. Her clothes were the clothes of a slave. Her frame was thin from years of barely eating enough. But she was standing before Allah with a concentration, a presence, a devotion that the master had never seen in anyone. And then he noticed something else. Above her head, according to the narration, there was a light, a glow, a nur that hovered in the space above her, illuminating the room in a way that no lamp or candle could explain. The entire house was lit by this light, and Rabia was at its center, lost in her prayer, unaware that anyone was watching, unaware of anything except the one she was speaking to. Now, whether you take this detail as literal or metaphorical, whether you understand it as a physical miracle or as the narrator's way of communicating the spiritual rank of this woman, the effect on the master was the same. He was terrified. Not the terror of seeing something dangerous, the terror of realizing something, the terror of understanding in a single moment that the woman he had treated as property was closer to Allah than he had ever been in his entire life. That the servant in his house carried a spiritual rank that he could not comprehend, that he had been blind, not in his eyes, but in his heart. He could not go back to sleep that night. The image stayed with him. The light stayed with him. And by the morning, a decision had formed inside him that he could not reverse. He called Rabia to him, and he set her free. Some narrations say he told her she could go wherever she wished. Others say he asked her to stay, offering to serve her instead. But Rabia chose freedom. She walked out of that house carrying nothing because she had nothing, and stepped into the streets of Basra as a free woman for the first time since her childhood. But here is what most people miss about this moment. Freedom for Rabia did not mean what it means for most people. She did not walk out of that house and think, now I can build a life, now I can find wealth, now I can find a husband and have children and be comfortable. She did not look at the world and see opportunity. She looked at the world and saw distraction. Because during all those years of slavery, during all those nights of prayer, Rabia had arrived at a conclusion that most people never reach. She had realized that the things of this world, comfort, wealth, status, even human love, were shadows. Beautiful, perhaps, tempting, certainly, but shadows nonetheless. And she had tasted something real, something that made the shadows irrelevant. She had tasted the love of Allah, and nothing in this dunya could compete with it. So Rabia chose a life of asceticism. She chose poverty, she chose solitude, not because she was forced into it. She had just been freed from a life of force. She chose it because she understood something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. She understood that the heart cannot hold two masters. It cannot love the world and love Allah with equal intensity. One will always win, and Rabia had already decided which one. She retreated from society. She dedicated herself entirely to worship, to prayer, to fasting, to a life so stripped of material comfort that it would make most people uncomfortable just to hear about it. She ate little. She owned almost nothing. Her home, if you could call it that, was bare, and yet the people of Basra began to talk about her. Not because she sought attention, she avoided it actively. Not because she preached in the marketplace. She had no interest in public speaking. They talked about her because there was something about her that was undeniable, a presence, a light, a quality that radiated from her that made people stop and listen when she spoke. And when she spoke about Allah, she spoke in a way that no one had heard before. She spoke about love. Now you have to understand the context to appreciate why this was so revolutionary. In the early centuries of Islam, the dominant discourse around faith was centered on fear and hope. Scholars spoke about fearing Allah's punishment and hoping for His reward. And these are absolutely valid, absolutely Quranic concepts. Allah Himself speaks of fear and hope throughout the Quran. There is nothing wrong with this framework. It is essential. But Rabia introduced a dimension that had not been articulated in quite the same way before. She spoke about loving Allah not because of what He gives and not because of what He might withhold, but simply because He is Allah. She spoke about a love that was not transactional, a love that did not depend on paradise or hellfire, a love that existed for its own sake. And this is where her story intersects with one of the most famous statements ever attributed to a Muslim in history. A statement that has been quoted in books of Islamic spirituality for over a millennium. A statement that scholars have debated, discussed, and marveled at from the moment it was first uttered. But before we get to that statement, there is something else that happened first. Something that reveals just how deep Rabia's understanding was and just how far she had traveled from the broken girl who was sold for a few dirhams. Because the greatest scholars and leaders of her time began coming to her, and what they found when they arrived was not what they expected. The stories of scholars and leaders seeking out Rabia are numerous, and each one reveals something different about her character. But there are a few encounters that stand above the rest. moments that cracked open the pretenses of the men who came to her and exposed the difference between knowledge and understanding, between ritual and reality, between saying you love Allah and actually meaning it. One of the most well-known encounters involves Hassan al-Basri. Now, Hassan al-Basri was not an ordinary scholar. He was one of the greatest figures of the Tabi'in, the generation that came after the companions of the Prophet, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. He was a man who had met and learned from the companions themselves. He was a master of Quranic tafsir, of hadith, of Islamic jurisprudence. When he spoke, thousands listened. His sermons made people weep. His knowledge was vast, and his reputation was towering. There is a discussion among historians about whether Hassan al-Basri and Rabia actually overlapped in time, as some scholars place her birth after his death. Some of the encounters attributed to them may be literary constructions used by later authors to illustrate spiritual truths rather than strict historical records. This is important to be honest about. The stories attributed to their interactions come primarily from later works of Sufi literature, and they function as teaching stories, windows into Rabia's worldview rather than journalistic accounts. But the lessons embedded in these narratives are genuine reflections of the spiritual tradition Rabia represented, and they are powerful. In one such narration, a scholar comes to Rabia and finds her in a state of such devotion that he is struck silent. He asks her about the path to Allah, how one can truly reach closeness with the divine, and Rabia's response is not what he expects. She does not give him a list of deeds. She does not prescribe more fasting, more prayer, more charity, though she practiced all of these herself in abundance. Instead, she speaks about the heart. She tells him that the path to Allah is not measured in the quantity of your worship, but in the quality of your intention. That a person can pray all night and still be distant from Allah if their heart is attached to something other than Him. This was not a rejection of worship. Rabia prayed more than almost anyone around her. This was a refinement of worship. She was saying that the body can bow while the heart wanders. The tongue can say, Subhanallah, while the mind counts coins. And Allah does not look at the movement of the limbs, He looks at the state of the heart. As the Quran says, it is not their meat nor their blood that reaches Allah, it is your piety that reaches Him. Surah Al-Hajj, verse 37. Rabia was living this ayah in a way that made the scholars around her uncomfortable because she was holding up a mirror and not everyone liked what they saw. Then there were the marriage proposals. And these were not casual offers. Powerful men, wealthy men, men of religious standing. They came to Rabia and offered her marriage. They offered her comfort. They offered her security. They offered her a life that most people in her situation would have accepted without hesitation. And she refused every single time. One narration records a man offering her wealth as part of a marriage proposal. Her response cut through every assumption he carried. She said something to the effect of, "You offer me the world, but the world distracts from Allah. If I accept this, my heart will be divided, and I will not divide my heart." She was not saying that marriage is wrong. Marriage is a sunnah. It is encouraged in Islam. She knew this. But she was saying that for her, specifically, the path Allah had placed her on required an undivided heart. She was not prescribing her path for others. She was walking her own path with a certainty that no one could shake. And then came the statement, the one that echoes across centuries, the one that has been quoted in more books of Islamic spirituality than perhaps any other statement by a non-prophetic figure. The one that, when you hear it, forces you to stop and examine your own heart. Rabia was seen one day carrying a torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. When someone asked her what she was doing, she said words to this effect, I want to pour water into hellfire and set fire to paradise so that people will stop worshipping Allah out of fear of hell or desire for paradise and instead worship Him for His sake alone. Read that again, slowly. She wanted to remove the two greatest motivators that drive human worship, fear of punishment and desire for reward, so that the only thing left would be pure, undiluted love for Allah. Now, this statement requires careful understanding. Rabia was not denying the existence of paradise and hell. She was not rejecting the Quranic framework. Paradise and hell are real. They are mentioned hundreds of times in the Quran. Fear of Allah and hope in His mercy are pillars of faith. No Muslim can dismiss them. What Rabia was doing was something more subtle and in many ways more radical. She was pointing to a station of the heart that exists beyond fear and hope. A station where the soul loves Allah, not because of what He gives or what He withholds, but because of who He is. Because He is al-Wadud, the loving, because He is al-Jamil, the beautiful, because He is the source of every good thing, and the heart that truly knows Him cannot help but love Him. This is not a rejection of Islamic theology, it is an elevation of it. The scholars of Tasawwuf, Islamic spirituality, have always taught that the highest stations of faith include the love of Allah for His own sake. Imam al-Ghazali, centuries later, would dedicate entire chapters of his Ihya Ulum al-Din to the concept of divine love, and he would reference Rabia as one of the earliest and most powerful voices in this tradition. But in her time, this statement shook people. Some were inspired, some were unsettled, some did not know what to do with a woman who spoke about Allah with a passion that exceeded their own. And here is the part of the story that most people overlook. Rabia did not just talk about love, she lived it. Her entire life was the proof. She did not speak about detachment from the world while secretly enjoying its comforts. She owned nothing. She wanted nothing. She gave everything to Allah, her time, her body, her youth, her health, her entire life. And she asked for nothing in return except His closeness. There is a narration where Rabia was asked, "Do you hate Shaitan?" And her response was astonishing. She said something to the effect of, "My love for Allah leaves no room in my heart for hatred of anyone." Think about the depth of that. She was so consumed by love for the divine that even the concept of hatred, even toward the enemy of humanity, could not find a foothold in her heart. She was not excusing Shaitan. She was describing a spiritual state so full of light that darkness simply had no space. But what did this kind of devotion cost her? What does it look like to give everything, truly everything, and ask for nothing in return? Because the answer to that question is written in the final chapters of Rabia's life. And it is not a story of triumph in the way the world understands triumph. It is something far deeper and far more unsettling. Rabia grew old. There is no getting around this part of the story, and there is no way to make it glamorous. She grew old in poverty. She grew old alone. She grew old in a small, bare room with no wealth, no family, no children to carry her name, and no legacy in the way that kings and conquerors leave legacies. If you were to walk into her dwelling in the last years of her life, you would find almost nothing. A worn mat for prayer, perhaps a clay jug for water, perhaps a brick or a stone that she used as a pillow. That was it. That was the sum of her worldly possessions. The scholars who visited her in these later years recorded their observations with a kind of awe that is hard to misunderstand. They did not pity her. They envied her. Because when they sat with her, they found a woman who had something they did not. Despite all their books, all their students, all their reputations, she had peace. Not the peace that comes from having enough money in the bank, not the peace that comes from knowing your future is secure, but the peace that comes from having settled the only question that ultimately matters: who do you belong to? Rabia had answered that question. She belonged to Allah completely, without reservation, without condition. and because that question was settled, nothing else could disturb her. There is a narration that describes how someone visited Rabia and found her in a state of illness. The visitor was distressed and asked her how she was. Rabia's response reflected a soul that had moved beyond the concerns that paralyze most people. She did not complain about her condition. She did not ask for help. She redirected the conversation to Allah, to worship, to the state of the heart. She was more concerned about the visitor's spiritual health than her own physical health. This is not the behavior of someone performing piety. This is the behavior of someone who has internalized it so deeply that it has become their natural language. When you are truly in love, everything reminds you of the beloved. Every conversation circles back. Every thought returns to the same center. For Rabia, that center was Allah, and it had been that center since those dark nights of slavery when she stood in prayer while the rest of the world slept. But let us also be honest about something that often gets lost in the retelling of Rabia's story. Her path was not easy. It was not romantic. The biographies sometimes present her with such reverence that we forget she was a human being. She felt hunger. She felt cold. She felt the weight of loneliness. She felt the temptation of ease. The difference between Rabia and most people was not that she did not feel these things. The difference was that she felt them and chose Allah anyway. Every single time. That is not the absence of struggle. That is the definition of it. And that is what makes her example so powerful, because if she were superhuman, if she were an angel, if she did not struggle, then her story would be irrelevant to us. We could admire it from a distance and say, well, she was different, she was special, that has nothing to do with me. But she was not different in her nature, she was different in her choice. She chose to prioritize the love of Allah above everything else. And that choice was available to her every day, just as it is available to us. The people of Basra seem to understand this on some level, because as Rabia aged, her influence did not diminish. It grew. People came to her from farther and farther away, not for fatwas. She was not a jurist, not for hadith. She was not a muhadith. They came to her for something that is harder to find than knowledge. They came for spiritual transformation. They came because being in her presence reminded them of why they were alive. It reminded them of what they had forgotten in the noise of daily life. It reminded them of Allah. And this is where Rabia's story intersects with a larger truth about the Islamic tradition. Islam has always had room for people like Rabia. The tradition of Zuhd, asceticism, detachment from the world, is not a fringe movement. It is embedded in the Quran and the Sunnah. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself lived a life of remarkable simplicity. He slept on a mat that left marks on his skin. He tied stones to his stomach out of hunger. He was offered the treasures of the earth and refused them. Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiallahu anhu, the mighty caliph who ruled an empire, was found sleeping under a tree with no guards. Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, radiallahu anhu, was so detached from wealth that he refused to accumulate anything beyond his daily needs. These are not marginal figures. These are the giants of Islam, and Rabia walked in their footsteps. She is often remembered as a Sufi figure, and that is not inaccurate. The tradition of Islamic spirituality that would later be called tasawwuf was deeply shaped by her teachings and her example. But it is important to understand that in Rabia's time, the formal structures of Sufi orders and schools did not yet exist in the way they would in later centuries. Rabia was simply a woman of profound taqwa. She was a worshipper. She was a lover of Allah. The labels came later. What did not come later was her impact. That was immediate and permanent. When Rabia al Adawi died, most scholars place her death around the year 185 AH, roughly 801 CE. She left behind no money. She left behind no property. She left behind no children. But she left behind something that gold cannot buy and time cannot destroy. She left behind a way of understanding the relationship between the human heart and its creator that would influence Islamic thought for over 1,200 years. She left behind words that still make people cry. She left behind an example that still makes scholars pause and ask themselves, do I really love Allah, or do I just love what Allah gives me? And that question, that uncomfortable, unavoidable question, is the fire that Rabia al-Basri carried. Not the torch she wanted to set to paradise, the fire inside her own heart, the fire of love, and it is still burning. But the deepest lesson of Rabia's life is not what she said, and it is not even what she did. It is something else entirely, something that most people who hear her story miss, and it is the one thing that, if you understand it, will change the way you think about your own faith. Here is what most people get wrong about Rabia al Adawi. They hear her story and they think the lesson is about giving up the world. They think the lesson is about poverty, about never marrying, about living in a bare room and sleeping on stones. And if that is all you take from Rabia, you have missed the point entirely. Rabia's lesson is not about what she gave up. It is about what she found. She did not live the way she lived because she hated the dunya. She lived the way she lived because she had found something so much greater that the dunya became invisible. She was not running from the world. She was running toward Allah. And there is a massive difference between those two things. A person who gives up the world out of bitterness is not a zahid. They are just bitter. A person who avoids marriage out of fear is not devoted. They are just afraid. But a person who looks at everything this life has to offer, comfort, wealth, companionship, security, and then looks at Allah, and their heart moves toward Allah with such force that everything else falls away, that person has found something real. That is what Rabia found. That is what she lived. That is what she died upon. And this is where her story stops being a historical account and starts becoming a mirror. Because the question she forces every one of us to face is not, would you give up everything for Allah? The question is far more personal than that. The question is, what are you clinging to right now that is standing between you and a deeper relationship with your Creator? It does not have to be money. It might be your reputation. It might be your comfort. It might be the approval of people. It might be the endless scroll of your phone, the hours lost in entertainment that leave you feeling emptier than when you started. It might be a relationship that you know is pulling you away from your salah, away from your Quran, away from the person you know you are supposed to become. Rabia did not have a phone. She did not have social media. She did not have streaming services or shopping apps, but the principle is the same across every century. The heart has limited space, and whatever fills it determines the quality of your faith. Allah tells us in the Quran, in Surah Ad-Dariyat, verse 56, "And I did not create the jinn and mankind except to worship me." This is the purpose. This is the reason for existence. Not to accumulate, not to be entertained, not to be comfortable, to worship Allah. And worship, as the scholars have explained, is not limited to salah and fasting. Worship is everything you do with the intention of pleasing Allah. Your work can be worship. Your kindness can be worship. Your patience in difficulty can be worship. But here is the key. Worship requires the heart. And if the heart is full of other things, full of anxiety about the dunya, full of desire for what others have, full of love for things that will not last, then the worship becomes a shell. It looks right on the outside, but it is hollow on the inside. Rabia understood this. She understood it not because someone explained it to her in a classroom, but because she lived it. She experienced what it means to have everything taken away and to find that Allah was still there. She experienced the truth of the Quranic promise. Is not Allah sufficient for His servant? Surah Az-Zumar, verse 36. She tested that promise. She tested it with her entire life, and she found it to be true. There is something else about Rabia's legacy that deserves attention, and it is the fact that she was a woman. In a historical landscape where the voices most often amplified are those of male scholars and leaders, Rabia's story stands as a powerful reminder that spiritual greatness in Islam has never been restricted by gender. The Quran itself makes this clear in Surah Al-Ahzab, verse 35, where Allah lists the qualities of believing men and believing women in parallel. Indeed, the Muslim men and Muslim women, the believing men and believing women, the obedient men and obedient women, the truthful men and truthful women, the patient men and patient women, the humble men and humble women, the charitable men and charitable women, the fasting men and fasting women, the men who guard their private parts and the women who do so, and the men who remember Allah often and the women who do so. For them, Allah has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. Rabia is proof that this ayah is not just theology. It is history, it is reality. A woman born into poverty, sold into slavery, with no formal education and no institutional support, became one of the most influential spiritual figures in the history of Islam. Her words are quoted alongside those of Rabia al-Basri, Ibrahim ibn Adham, and other towering figures of Zuhd. Her example is taught in the most prestigious institutions of Islamic learning. She did not achieve this despite being a woman. She achieved it while being a woman who faced obstacles that most of her male contemporaries never had to confront, and her greatness was not questioned by the scholars who came after her. Imam al-Ghazali honored her teachings. Farid al-Din Attar devoted pages to her. Ibn al-Jawzi, the great Hanbali scholar, included her among the righteous. Her gender was never a barrier to recognition in the tradition that valued taqwa above all else. And this is fitting because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told us that Allah does not look at your appearance or your wealth. He looks at your hearts and your deeds. This hadith, recorded in Sahih Muslim, is the principle that Rabia lived and breathed. She had no appearance of power, she had no wealth, but her heart was a furnace of love for Allah, and her deeds were the purest expression of that love. So what remains for us? Rabia is gone. She has been gone for over 1,200 years. The streets of Basra where she walked have been rebuilt 100 times over. The scholars who visited her are dust. The empires that rose and fell during her lifetime are chapters in history books. But the fire is still here. The love she spoke about is still accessible. The closeness to Allah she experienced is still available. The choice she made to prioritize the eternal over the temporary is still on the table, right now, today, for you. You do not need to be a scholar. You do not need to be wealthy. You do not need to be from a noble family or a famous lineage. Rabia had none of these things. She had a heart that chose Allah, and Allah chose her back. There is a prayer attributed to Rabia that captures everything she stood for. Scholars have recorded it in various forms across the centuries, and it serves as a window into the deepest chambers of her soul. The essence of it is this: O Allah, if I worship you out of fear of hell, then burn me in hell. If I worship you out of hope for paradise, then exclude me from paradise. But if I worship you for your own sake alone, then do not withhold from me your eternal beauty. That is not just a prayer. That is a declaration. That is a woman standing before the Creator of the heavens and the earth with nothing in her hands, nothing to her name, and saying, I am not here for what you can give me. I am here for you. 1,200 years later, we are still talking about her. 1,200 years later, her words still pierce the heart. 1,200 years later, we are still asking ourselves the question she asked. The question that has no comfortable answer. The question that separates the casual believer from the one who truly loves. Do you love Allah? Or do you just love what Allah gives you? Close your eyes for a moment. Be honest with yourself, not with the person sitting next to you, not with the image you project, with yourself. with the part of you that only Allah can see. And if the answer is not what you wish it were, that is not a reason for despair. That is a reason for hope. Because Rabia's story proves that transformation is possible. That the girl who was sold for a few dirhams can become the woman whose words outlive empires. That the slave who owned nothing can possess a closeness to Allah that kings would trade their kingdoms for. Your starting point does not matter. Your past does not disqualify you. Your sins do not erase the path. The path is still there. The door is still open. And the one you are walking toward is Al-Ghafur, the repeatedly forgiving, Al-Wadud, the loving, Al-Karib, the near. Rabia knew this. She knew it in chains. She knew it in freedom. She knew it in poverty. She knew it in old age. She knew it in the last breath she ever took. And now you know it too.